Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest Fight Club webinar. Today, we're going to be looking back in time to the Second World War, the last major conflagration on Europe and in Europe until February 2022. Specifically, we're going to be examining the legacy of that conflict in today's Western defense discourse. This webinar is perfectly situated in November. We've just had Remembrance last week. And there's been a lot of commentary about veterans and the global order we live in today being more uncertain and more unstable than it's been ever before. So what we're going to talk about in the context of the webinar is the things that we should take from World War II, which are still relevant, but also potentially some things which we have taken as granted that may no longer be true in our current modern security, geopolitical climate. And effectively, we are being anchored to a bygone time, and that is limiting our thinking. And this is, of course, open to interpretation and opinion. So we encourage a full and thoughtful and fruitful debate with those of you who are joining us live. Our guest speaker tonight is Professor Andrew Stewart, a visiting professor from King's College London, with which Fight Club has an affinity through the wargaming and war studies department, in which he completed his undergraduate degree. He's remained in the same department to complete his doctorate. He's done a load of different studies on various things, but I will call out especially in the Second World War and British history during the 20th century. So uniquely qualified to talk about the Western perspective of this and not just apologies about that. I'll reset. Can I just get a confirmation the slide share is back up?
Not at the moment.
None of that? Okay, no worries. That was the strike we were talking about. It got me. Okay, back up.
Yep, all good.
Okay, awesome. Right, I'll just reset from the introduction for yourself, and then we'll splice that out as if it never happened. Okay, our guest speaker tonight is Professor Andrew Stewart, a visiting professor in the School of Security Studies, King's College London, with which Fight Club has an affinity through the war studies and the wargaming course run by Dr. David Banks. It's there he completed his undergraduate degree. He's remained in the same department to study part-time for his doctorate. He's got a number of research interests, war and conflict, Second World War, and the British history during the 20th century. So uniquely qualified to talk about the Western perspective of the legacy of the Second World War, not to discount the Eastern, but we are mostly interested in the Western legacy, being Westerners at the moment. He's also supported military forces in the context of a land historian for the High Command Staff course and the Royal College of Defence Studies, and became a professor of modern conflict history in 2018 and a founding director of the King's Second World War Research Group, and he currently heads its advisory group. So, Professor Stewart, you're very welcome to have you on tonight, and I understand you've been travelling intensively in the past couple of weeks, so it's great to manage to fit this in. Would you like to say any few words before I move on to our opening question for the audience?
I just want to thank you for the opportunity to join this group this evening. I'd add 2 points to the bio, and forgive me my croaky voice, as I was saying earlier. I've got one of the many variants of whatever's going around, but I'm currently actually I'm a head of section at the Chaser. Chaser is the Centre for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research. So it's the British Army's think tank. I thought I was going there as the head of historical analysis. I've ended up there as head of conflict research, which I suppose shows that I'm a bit of a switch hitter. The reason I mentioned it is it's proven to be a fascinating place to be for a year now. And we use history to inform and better understand both the present, but also to guide us towards the future. So, looking at this, I think what is now kind of termed as applied history is very much the fore. The second one, and people on the call might be less enthused about this, I was fortunate last week to go to the cast and crew screening of SAS Rogue Heroes Season 2. which I was the historical advisor for. Ben McIntyre obviously wrote the book, I, for my sins, was asked to provide some historical analysis, which has been very interesting, but also again demonstrates the degree to which I think the Second World War continues to have this fascination. I know that that series, Rogue Heroes, they commissioned the second season before the first episode of the first season had broadcast, which is incredibly unusual for historical, whether it be dramatization or documentary. So, it remains, I think globally, there is something about the Second World War that continues to resonate. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And Chaser is also responsible for version 1, Camberley Kriegspiel. So then there's a wargaming link there that I'd like to shout out to. So an absolute fantastic example of Venn diagrams aligning for once. So what we're going to do before we go into the talk, rest assured there is a talk prepared. Andrew's got loads of commentary, but we would like to involve the audience at this early stage. So in the chat, please write your answer, just one answer, I think, the most important answer from each person. What do you think the greatest legacy of World War II is today in the context of Western defense thinking? So don't just write the legacy is like 50 million casualties. Please write something that we're going to be able to extrapolate to for Western defense discourse. Okay, whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, whether you think it's right or wrong, just go for that couple of minutes in the chat, please.
If it's any help while people are thinking, it reminds me of I went to Australia just as COVID was starting to become principal at the Australian War College. And the first essay question I set for the entire course was, is war an art or a science or a combination of both? And I can honestly say that the entire course pretty much hated me. I thought it was a great question because it was completely open-ended, but it wasn't a great question. And this is a difficult question. Can you name one specific legacy? There are perhaps multiple, but got a
I've
couple
had
coming through.
similar examples when someone says, is wargaming art or science? And you can divide a room.
Yep.
It's the wargaming equivalent of, do you stand in the model to brief or stand outside the model to brief for the infantry, which seems to, it's heresy either way you look at it from certain
Very
people's
much so.
perspectives. And you can quite quickly put people into two brackets, whether you think it's an art or a science, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the engineers in particular did not like me.
Okay, so a couple of things that are coming up in the chat just to highlight. So I like Ben's honesty. That's a hard one. Okay, no worries. Andrew's going to take you through for the rest of the hour. But we've got institutional reflex towards armor and air superiority. I think that speaks to the idea of metrics of military power being armor and air superiority, the primacy of armored mechanized operations. Freedom and democracy, accomplishment, loyalty, resilience, foreign intelligence defense. Quite a lot there, but I suppose maybe that linking maybe to your total war comment you're going to come to later. Prominence of industrial production and logistics. Well, if that is a lesson, I think we've absolutely forgotten that one, but more to follow. And then Besser just wants to just put the nail in the coffin that engineers only like themselves, nobody else, which is fair. Okay. Any comment, Andrew, on the comments from the floor?
Good, I mean, again, exactly what I would hope for and anticipate. And again, it shows that I think people on the call are both knowledgeable and interested. I mean, it's a massive question, isn't it? I mean, I suspect some people could even argue that there isn't really a legacy. That, warfare today, like going back to that point about the fascination, that warfare today actually has moved on and is very different. I mean, the nature of war doesn't change, but the character does. And in some respects, perhaps we are moving into a different era. There's a lot of, I mean, I've not read it yet, but the West Point, there was a piece published, I think yesterday or the day before, that was sort of arguing maybe the nature is changing. I'm not sure. I mean, I mean, I'm a Second World War historian, but as we kind of brought out, I look at the past, but I also look at the present. And I mean, trying to make predictions about the future is A, notoriously difficult, and B, really, quite silly, because you're going to end up looking, well, quite silly. But you can certainly look at the past for what's going on in the here and now. And I mean, can we go to the first slide? And you'll see that the slides are not particularly, they're just a couple of throwaway words. I mean, has the Second World War left us? Yes, international cooperation. That is it. Well, I mean, I think that's just to sort of to go to on the promo poster for it. I think that's very much about the strategically inflexible versus legacy alliances, and we can maybe come on to that. And I mean, the degree to which perhaps NATO. So, I mean, again, spoiler alert. I mean, so my background, although I've taught around the world, or been lucky enough to be involved in military colleges around the world, I'm very much, I spent 20 years at the UK Defence Academy, and in those 20 years, I was pretty much working with the Army. UK Defence Academy, for those who are not familiar with it, is joint, but as you sort of go up the line, you do get a little bit more opportunity to focus in on the service. So I was land historian on the warfighting course, the higher command. Yes, sorry, Shrivner indeed. And then I went to be the director at the Royal College of Defence Studies, but again with a sort of very much a kind of land focus. So a lot of my observations, a lot of my conclusions are very much in that domain. And therein perhaps is something that's interesting about the expansion of domains and this movement towards multi-domain operations. But I mean, conventional or irregular. If you look at the British Army at the end of the Second World War, it becomes in effect two forces, not necessarily by design, but by accident, the accident being the Cold War. But you'd fought the Second World War, which effectively becomes, however, whatever you anticipate it being at the beginning, it does become a war of mass. Yes, there's maneuver, and the side or the coalition or group which can actually conquer maneuver better will prevail. But it's about mass. You get to the end of the war, and of course, as with most wars, you get that legacy, not the legacy, you get the idea that we're going to get this benefit from the war. We're going to collapse our forces down and go back to the bare minimum, and that would have been the plan. I mean, you have the discussions at the end of the Second War about what the British Army would look like, what the British military would look like. All right, tempered by the fact that you've got this, and I don't know, is it a revolution or is it an evolution or is it just, but whatever you want to class nuclear weapons as, that becomes, if you like, a tremendous opportunity to move away from the cost of conventional forces. But then the Cold War sort of intervenes, and you can't do that. So you've got these two organizations that exist in parallel. I just reviewed Ian Beckett's what I thought was very good short history of the British Army. He makes the point about you've got the quasi-imperial, so the force that fights the irregular. So he's going to fight those sort of conflicts of decolonization, end of empire, however you want to describe it. And then you've got the British Army of the Rhine, which again, it's the European liberation, it's the Liberation Army that fights its way through France, northern France and the Low Countries into Germany in 44 into 45, and then becomes the occupying or sort of garrison force, but then quickly reinvents and becomes this, at its height, 55,000 strong force, which exists to deter or not any potential Soviet advance. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the lessons were in that regard to the Second World War. The British military fights lots of irregular campaigns. And again, it's sort of Beckett makes the point between 1815 and 1914, Britain only fights one conventional war. Between the end of the Second World War and, well, pretty much today, you could sort of, Korea obviously is a conventional war. You can say the Falklands is a conventional war, although it's unusual in so much as it's a war for, although, I mean, there is some, very useful American logistical and intelligence and what have you going on as support, but it's a war fought pretty much on our own. But beyond that, the British experience of the military, I mean, I'm not really sure I class Gulf One. It is conventional, but it's so brief, and it's against an opponent who, to preserve their own ability to continue to rule, more or less removes their air power from the battle quite early on. So I'm always hesitant about lessons from Gulf One, but I come back to this point from the British perspective. Whatever you've learned about fighting through that, particularly that 44, 45 period, you don't uninvent or disinvent it. It's just that you have to then move on to running kind of parallel organizations, which in many cases don't actually interact a great deal with one another. And I would say therein is something that's quite interesting going into the war, the degree to which military organizations have been genuinely learning organizations. They then do have to become learning organizations in the Second World War. It takes a period of time, but the British Army is pretty good at it by the end. The Americans also are very good at it by the end. The Germans start very good at it. But you kind of you do forget some of that. So you know, I think that because this tends to be the big focus on looking at the Second World War and what the legacy would be. Large armies, the Cold War, which we were just talking about before we went on air, and not wishing to be flippant, but, we may yet find out whether the Suwalki Gap is the Fulda Gap or not. But the Third World War never fought. So John Hackett's or any of the other various kind of imaginings of it was large conventional armies slugging it out on the sort of the German plains. We never saw that. That never happened. NATO Warsaw Pact. It was a Cold War. It never went hot. But the real fighting for the British Army was going on in places like Malaya, in Borneo, Kenya, Aden. Obviously, Dhofar, which is then thrown out as perhaps an example of success. So I don't know. I'm loath to say that the Second World War fixed. Now that's the British, and I appreciate, as I said in my trailer, there are lots of other, you know, different different militaries will have different views on what the Second World War taught or didn't teach them, and what then dragged through. But the Cold War is, I think, for most sides, it's how I just described it. Other than in the case of the US, which it's what I would describe as irregular or limited or non-conventional. They become much more attritional, much conflicts that have much greater level of mass. Vietnam being the obvious example to it. So, I mean, I don't know how you want to do it, Ed. I mean, I'm quite happy to sort of take if anybody's got any comments or observations or questions, or we just go straight on to the next slide. There are
Yeah,
only
I think
eight. There are only 8 slides, so I mean, we could run through
yeah,
them
yeah.
and then have questions at the end, or comments or discussion.
I think it's worth touching on each one as we go. But and if people don't have comments, then that's a good sign. You can move on. What I was going to just to demonstrate I am listening on this early part was to say, for me, there's been a huge legacy of this, particularly in land forces, where lots of hours, millions of hours and millions of papers of staff work have gone into whether a Western nation should have sort of one or two armies, and that then turns into a sort of quad triangle of like, do you want to have a large army capable of doing the worst case, which you then have to train specifically to do coin or unconventional? Do you just have a small army that does coin and then you scale up the nation to fight a large war, but noting that the timelines aren't necessarily the same anymore? Do you have one of each? And that's like the BAOR versus the army in Northern Ireland, the American army in Europe versus the American army in Vietnam. Um, and I think that is often the debate that rages and justification for funding, because the coin army is smaller and cheaper in theory, but is often more bloody in the sense that you are using it a lot around the world in nasty places, whereas the large army is more expensive, bigger, a lot of tech, industrial complex incentives, and lots of general officers, lots of staff, bloated hierarchy. So a good career model doesn't really get used once and is effectively an insurance policy. So I don't know if you've got any quick comments on that, or anyone else in the call wants to jump in on that.
People are thinking, I mean, that's because again, what you've highlighted there is it's that idea, isn't it? It's better to be strong everywhere, but it comes down to resource. And I mean, I mean, I joined Shrivenham in 2002, and I mean, the war on terror was only sort of a year in, and people were still really thinking about. There was very little discussion really about coin. It was actually an interesting time for curriculum development, because people were kind of, what is the next war? What is the next war going to look like? Because we've kind of gone through that 10 years following the end of the Cold War. Hopefully we can park conventional. We'll never have to do that again. And then you find yourself dragged into these two wars of choice, because but they're wars of choice that lack any clear end state. And without that with a lack of end state, it really nobbles you a bit in terms of how you're going to conduct them. So it's the golf bag, and it's the idea of having every club in it and being able to say, right, we've got this particular force, it's going to do this. We've got this particular force, it's going to do that. And very difficult. And of course, one force that's trained for, I was of an era that we trained, or rather not trained, educated several hundred army officers who went through stabilization courses. Now, I don't know what that actually did for them subsequently, um, particularly as you sort of pivot back to war fighting. But anyway, that's just my tuppence on that.
Any comments from the floor? Okay, moving on.
So, I mean, some of this is deliberately intended to overlap. I mean, I think I'll go back a little bit there to what I just said on sort of having an end state, having a knowing why you're fighting. I mean, again, many of you on the call will be as aware of, if not more, but strategic thought, really, you can boil it down in essence to a couple of fairly standard truisms. But one of them is that if you don't really know why you're fighting, then you're better off not fighting. The Second World War is an existential conflict. I mean, it starts off, I mean, you could say to begin with, I mean, it depends if you want, if you're of the school of thought that traces its origins back to the early 30s, and Japan and China, which I think there's a reasonable logic there. But if you sort of mark it as September 39 and the outbreak of the war, specifically in Europe, notwithstanding that the United States is neutral, the Soviet Union has signed the non-aggression pact, so they're not involved in it. You could say it's localized. It is it's another European civil conflict, which maybe could have been contained. I don't know, it's possible. But once, for whatever reason, the United Kingdom determines that it's going to fight, and it's got a very strong alliance with France. People, I think, sometimes overlook the degree to which the Anglo-French alliance going into the Second World War, it's much stronger than it had been at the beginning of the First World War, I think. All right, it's a bit more rushed in terms of, the staff talks, what they're going to do. They don't really have a clear, I think, strategy. I know, for those of you who looked at it, there is a strategy. The BF goes across. You've got the dial plan and what you're going to do, but it's never really been thought through. I mean, this group here, wargaming it would have been brilliant if they could have wargamed in the back end of 1939 what the Anglo-French plan was actually going to look like when it was put into action. I think that would have been revelatory to some of those involved. But the point was, it sort of got out of control and it became a total war, because Britain, in not losing, and that's not to be hypercritical of the French, but the French Empire's knocked out. Britain and its empire, and that was when I started long ago on my studies. I was looking at Britain and its empire of 500 million people. It remained in the conflict, and it determined that it wasn't going to seek a negotiated settlement. Clearly, all the evidence subsequently shows that on the German side, Adolf Hitler thought that the UK, England specifically, would recognise it was beaten and would sue for a peace. But we chose not to. And from that point on, the war's then going to carry on. And once the unconditional surrender statement's made at Casablanca in January 43, it is genuinely existential, because there's no room for manoeuvre. The Allies have said, right, we're going to fight until you are effectively completely destroyed and you accept our terms. There'll be no negotiation, no discussion. We will impose upon you the terms. And the Axis has kind of already gone down that same route anyway, because it's precipitated the war and is prosecuting the war. So you kind of come out of this second war to end all wars. So, from 1914 to 1945, you've had two wars to end all wars, which, by definition suggests that you shouldn't have had two. What does it mean for the third one? And I mean, I think, at the very least, there is an apathy. A good friend made a point to me recently about, all right, we're looking at it through the lens of black and white footage. And yes, there is clearly, a lot of euphoria within the crowds. But if you look at the scenes in London, specifically on VE Day, so next year will be the 80th anniversary of VE Day. There is a lot of, there's a lot of outburst of emotion, but it's more relief and quite a bit of exhaustion in there. If you look at some of the sort of mass observation reports that were going on, people were just grateful to have survived and to have got through it. And I guess where I'm going with that is that then, if anything, you can see why there's that shift to, we don't want to get caught up fighting one of these again. We don't want to have to fight a war for national survival. Um, they are incredibly expensive. They are incredibly destructive. Nobody really benefits from it. Yes, we've survived, but at what cost? But then the Cold War comes along, and you're faced potentially by another existential threat. You're faced by an opponent who seems, for whatever reason, to have almost at an ideological level a kind of quite binary view that it's either their system or not. So you've got no choice but to once again ramp up your force, ramp up your defense posture, and commit to fighting this total war. But at the same time, going through a period of decolonization with limited engagements, some of which are connected directly to that Cold War. So that can be, the kind of proxy surrogate fights that go on, places like Angola, even, where the two ideologies are competing against one another, or in other instances, completely different. But it's, I look at the Second World War and what did we learn from it, and that was really that we wouldn't want to fight another one. If we could avoid it, we wouldn't want to fight another one. But as it became clear that there was no choice, and I suppose that's the question I ask now, particularly as we look at the current situation we're in: is the memory too long past? Have people forgotten? You have these long periods of peace, actually quite long periods of peace, sort of 50-year pieces, looking throughout history of conflict. And so 50 years tends to be about the optimum point when people start to forget. Clearly we're coming up on 80 years next year, so we're well out of the range of people forgetting. I wonder what the appetite is for it. I don't know.
Andrew, where do you sit on the sort of war peace, because these binary terms, we've had a lot of examples since World War II of sort of, I'm not mean operations other than war. What I mean is, like, Korea was described as a police action for political reasons. Putin's called the Russo-Ukraine war a special military operation. There wasn't an Afghanistan war. There was an operation in Afghanistan. There's a lot of combat which is not referred to as a war. It's in that kind of limited engagement area, even though you would say Ukraine is fighting a war of existential survival and so on and so forth. So the language, I'm talking more about the language. The use of language is almost deliberately pivoted away from the term war, not to necessarily downplay the suffering and the damage and the distress of the actual those involved in the conflict. And this might bleed into your legal, ethical alliance kind of space as well, but
A little bit, but I mean, yeah, I mean, it's an excellent observation, and it's in that title there, and I think it's because war, certainly that experience, and whether it be the Second World War or the First World War, it's the totality of it. I mean, yes, we know that total war as a term is coined about the Second World War, but it's, if you actually get involved in a war, there is that sense that it requires, having watched Wolverine and Deadpool only the other night, it's maximum effort, isn't it? You have to, you're in a war. It's not about half measures. You don't enter a war lightly, or you shouldn't enter a war lightly, because ultimately that's not going to go well for you. And that's why I think by deliberately, if you like, adding either nuance or some sort of dilution and using these other terms, you avoid that. Because if you say, right, we're in a war, that to me is then a strong combat indicator that, right, we've got to ramp up. We've got to mobilize. And I mean, this is a big debate, not just in the UK but across Europe. I mean, put total war there actually could have put total defense. So I mean, I was in Denmark last year, and have continued this year to do quite a lot of work with Chaser on Scandinavia and the Nordic region, and their approach to these things. And total defense, I would say, in many ways, is actually gearing up for a full-on war. you are mobilizing your resources. You are doing it in a minimalist way. It's not about trying to stand up an army of 100,000 and then sustain and pay the costs of it, but to have in place. I mean, look at the Finns. I mean, the Finnish model. They don't call it total defense. They call it comprehensive defense, which I think is genius because that just takes it to another dimension. But you're right. I mean, it all lies in a word. And I think that's one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin has sought to avoid using the word. I mean, in his possibly recorded or possibly live broadcast today, he reverted back to his special military operation terminology. But the Kremlin has referred to it in recent months as a war. And as I say, I just think it's got that kind of extra dimension. If it's an emergency, it's, the Malayan emergency. Okay, all right, then we can respond to that. As you say, Korea is a UN, it's a policing security operation. Afghanistan and Iraq, well, again, they were responses to particular actions. War at a societal level, I think, has a much higher level of engagement.
There's also a word which is used for a certain thing going on at the moment, that word being genocide, which is even further to the right of a description of war. I don't think we need to get into the specific views on that, but it's just another example of like there are words to the right of war as well.
There are, and I mean, but again, going back to the example and the sort of the question, if you like, here of the Second World War. I mean, there had been genocides in history before. I mean, unfortunately, as a species, we do have an almost unlimited capacity to kill one another, and at times on an industrial, organized level, which I think really is kind of where genocide is pointing. But the Second World War does take it to a whole new, with the Holocaust, the Shoah, and others. There are other. I mean, some of what the Soviets did as well could easily be constituted as genocidal. But you would have hoped, wouldn't you, that at the end of it, there would have then been, and it was, the UN was supposed to have been the manifestation of it. This will not happen again. And with the UN, of course, the various mechanisms for justice, and unfortunately, no method of enforcing them. Though that's the problem. But yeah, I mean, genocide certainly sits with that. We might come onto that a bit more in the sort of legal and ethics if anybody wants to pick it up. So logs. I mean, in the same way as I'll put my cards out on the table. And this has not been without challenge through sort of 25 years of military education. I am a passionate believer in the importance of logistics and sustainment. As a civilian who has never worn a uniform and has never had any practitioner involvement, but as a historian and looking at the here and now, I don't really understand how you can conceive of fighting, to go back to your point there, on a war or whatever it might be, without having an in place resilient system that can deal with it. And I mean, if there is one thing that you should look for from the Second World War as a legacy, it is this, because I mean, ultimately, you can only prosecute both campaigns. I mean, because really, after the Mediterranean campaign, which sort of leads or precipitates in the end European, because you then sort of leapfrogging through Sicily and Italy. But you can only do it as a result of the build-up that you put in to create that force that can then cross the channel and break in to occupied Europe and then break out. But it requires a phenomenal effort. It requires the mobilization of not just the British Commonwealth industry, but obviously the United States. I mean, the United States goes from being an important, significant industrial power to being the global leader. By the end of the Second World War, Britain is bankrupt. The United States has easily usurped it as the economic superpower. But it's to create that logistical base which allows you to operate. It is that from which military operations develop. And then the sustainment obviously is also critical, but often overlooked, because it's all well and good to generate your force to be able to do that break-in, but you've got to then sustain it as it continues. 21st Army Group is using something like 20,000 gallons of petrol a day. I mean, it's the whole sort of that campaign through Normandy, and then that drives all the way through to it never quite gets to Berlin, unfortunately. But it's a war of statistics. It's a war of numbers. It's a war of log tables. It's a war of movement. But you've created the beast, but you've then got to feed the beast, because otherwise, the beast can't move forward. And I think, again, this is one of those, maybe, that if you look through conflicts of recent history, it's, from a British perspective, again, I labour the point, but if you look at the Anglo-Dutch, what I grew up calling the Boer conflict, but the Anglo-Dutch conflict, I mean, there's a big logistics piece in there. We know from the First World War there's a big logistics piece. We know even from the Napoleonic campaigns, it's, in many respects, there's a big logistics, and you could go much further back through to antiquity. But the Second World War it's that total war piece. You can't prosecute a total war without having a total logistical framework in place to be able to do it. I can't remember the exact figure. It's something like, mind-boggling, like Ford Motors from December 1941 to the end of the war only produces 50 cars, because the entire production line's turned over to producing war materials. But again, it comes at a cost. It's a huge cost, and I worry in terms of legacies, that there's a poor legacy here. That, again, as Ukraine is demonstrating the conflict there, to actually sustain a modern battle, whatever that might be, or to endure in a modern battle space, comes at significant cost. You have to be able to maintain it, and European Union, or Europe as a geographical body, has struggled to create the resources necessary. I mean, it's taken pretty much everything that everyone's got, notwithstanding obviously the massive support that's come from the United States, just to keep Ukraine going. So that's one state acting against, I know not necessarily one state in the case of the Russian Federation and the support it gets, but it's huge. So I think we forgot a lot of lessons because they come at cost. What concerns me is the degree to which it's not just the lesson, the idea, it's the degree to which we no longer have the framework. So, I mean, in the UK, for example, with the closure or mooted closure of a steel foundry, there will be no capacity in the UK to manufacture steel. That's going to be challenging if we suddenly find ourselves in an emergency where you need to create large numbers of platforms at pace. Just one example of. Any other loggies on the call?
So Bess has put something down about it's a bit high level, but the Belton Road. Bess, did you want to?
Yeah, BRI, yeah. Can you, is there any chance, could you read that? Because I'm struggling a bit on the eyesight today.
Yeah, no worries. So speaking of logistics and sustainment, is the Belton Road a dual use tech or approach that can be used for military purposes, or does it pose legal liability as it is passing through several countries? Think of it
Yeah,
like recon on rail.
yeah, no, I mean, BRI is, well, I mean, primarily, yes, it is for the economic advantage of China, but I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Certainly in terms of deep water harbors that they've built and the locations of them. Yes, it would offer a significant advantage in time of war. So yeah, I mean, calling it dual use, I think, is absolutely sensible. The degree to which, in time of war, though, it would actually be able to use those facilities, I don't know, because they are pretty well out there. Everybody knows where they are, and I suspect that they wouldn't last very long if push came to shove. But there again, China, I think, works on the basis of having lots of contingency, lots of resilience, and just because they're out there, that might not be the only show in town for them. But it does show that China is well aware of the significance of this. Whatever, and that it's a complete sort of hole we could go down, but I don't for imagine that if China was going to war, it wouldn't have a fairly clear end state. I think it would be fairly clear on what it was doing and why it was doing it, and therefore, what it considered to be achievable goals, what the various phases and stages were of its campaign planning. I know we get fixed on Taiwan. I mean, I had a couple of years in Australia, and it's sort of, geographically adjacent, but there are maybe other areas as well that China's thinking of more long term. So
Something I was thinking about was military structures. I haven't done a lot of research on this, but in the idea of tooth to tail, and the requirements have a lot of troops working in rural areas to do your large conventional warfighting sustainment. And a lot of our lean modern structures, we have much reduced rear areas because we are privileging maneuver forces, possibly because we want to go do counterinsurgency stuff, etc. But I mean, I've just Googled it, but apparently the ratio was 19% combat proportion in World War II and only 6.5% in 1974. So it seems to be going down in the sense of there's more rear area stuff, but that probably accounts for specialisms, signals, cyber.
yeah, yeah, and I
Whether
mean,
artillery get counted in that these days, I don't know. But I do certainly see structures as privileging, and this is also where politics with a small p comes in. Cap badges, which are generally speaking more numerous at the front line than they are in the rear area.
yes, I mean, I think you bring in there the role of technology. I mean, technology as an enabler or a multiplier, however you want to describe it. But again, it requires a fair degree of specialism to make it work. I mean, I still have a link with Australia. I'm still an honorary professor down there, and so do some work with our equivalent, so the Australian Army Research Centre. And there's been a lot of work done in Australia over the last 12 months looking at, and we've done some as well ourselves, but looking at human machine and, an interface and team and what have you. And, the Australian model as proposed, which I think is probably going to go away, was a battalion with no more than 100 troops in it. The rest of the battalion's fighting power was in effect all of the various, bits and pieces of exquisite technology that are out there. I don't know. I mean, I think whatever the balance is, I mean, if you were saying it's sort of 1 to 6 in the Second World War, did you say 16 or 21%?
We're saying like 22% were combat
Yeah.
and the rest were
Okay.
down. It's
So
gone down to
so
like 6% combat.
yeah. So I mean, if it was kind of 1 to 4, then one at the front, four behind. And if it's 6, well, that's it's 1 to 16, isn't it? So if anything, are we saying then that our combat power, our fighting power, isn't necessarily through that, whether it be, that combined arms maneuver that's going on at the front? I think that's a bit naive if you are. And again, to go back to the sort of the Second World War as a conflict to consider, ultimately you have to build up mass. I mean, I know those figures come from there, but I suspect that's because it's looking at it globally, which is a bit more complicated. But the goal for the European theatre, so the sort of North, well, the 1944-45, was to get to 94 divisions, which they didn't get to, but nonetheless, it's a big effort. I mean, where you are, I mean, the Canadians have 1 million troops in Europe by the end of the war. And I mean, all right, that can be front, back, tail, teeth, whatever, but it's still about mass. Mass has a quality all of its own. And having sort of started this by talking about those two armies, Ukraine doesn't seem to be demonstrating that lean, agile forces have decisive effect, unless I'm missing something. And that's not to be critical of Ukraine and what it's doing, far from it. But it's difficult to break through when your opponent is able to concentrate mass. I'm not saying, that it's concentrating a decisive force, but it's concentrating mass, which it then combines with one of the things that Russia is very good at, is fixed defense and fortification. And then obviously it's fallen back on its old tried and trusted its use of fires, now sort of supplemented by some more modern technological enhancers to it. But you've got to have troops, you've got to have bodies of troops, and if you're going to do that, and it's troops with armor, and I mean there is a discussion. One of the questions already asked was about that, the role of the tank or the role of the armored fighting vehicle. which I think is coming out of Ukraine, that the Bradley has been very well received and has performed very well. But if you're going to do it, you've got to sustain them. You've got to keep them going in the field. You know, at one point, I mean, one of the reasons why Russia managed to get momentum going, I think, this year was the fact that Ukraine was struggling to actually get ordnance, and was therefore having to restrict the amount that it could use in its fires. I think that proves straight away that you know you've got to be able to saturate the battlefield. It's not just about precision; it's about being able to bring in quite a lot of fires. So I I don't see. I mean, this is going forward into NATO plus plus where we're at now, which NATO in its 32 state form. The new NATO model, well, I say new, I mean it was the one that was kind of sort of agreed at Vilnius and then reinforced out of Washington this year. I mean, the British Army is supposed to be putting in 2 divisions and a corps headquarters. That's quite a big ask. Um, where I was in Denmark, the Danes are supposed to be putting a division in. I mean, we're getting back almost to Cold War numbers. Um, but even with that discussion, the Cold War numbers, I was reading a piece on Bagnall the other day, and Bagnall fighting there. So you know, perhaps perhaps one of the most inspirational and cerebral senior British commanders, but I think not necessarily always well remembered. Um, he's still fighting multi-core or considering multi-core actions. I mean, multiple core actions, but with the reality that NATO, certainly first echelon, are going to get defeated and overwhelmed. And it's a question, therefore, of how long you can hold out until you get your follow-on forces into theatre. Is that where we're going again? Are we sort of, are we saying that actually you've got to concentrate your force, but then you've got to build up your force, and only when you've got it built up can you break out. If you look at Overlord, Overlord has a very limited, actually has a very limited plan, other than you're across the Seine after 90 days. There are various options in terms of how it might be done, but it doesn't really go very well, as we know. But then it goes brilliantly. Now that's the attritional element of it to a degree, but you've got to still get that force there to then do something with it. So I mean, warfare, the army of warfare is supposed to be maneuver, isn't it? But you've got to have force to maneuver. Bit of a
Yeah,
ramble there, sorry, but
no, that's good. There was a good comparison to like the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023, and that someone was comparing it to papers from sort of June, July 1944 about how slow the Allied breakout was. Is sort of like everyone just calm
yeah,
down. This is a slow and then fast, like going bankrupt, gradually and then quickly, kind of thing.
it's
So maybe
great observation.
that's a truism.
Great
I was going to say
observation. Yeah.
and this might link into your legacy alliances bit, but the traditional model of the West has been to effectively say, if you do break the rules-based international order, we will build an iron mountain, and we will over time, and we will slowly push it at you, and it will be unstoppable, and we will reestablish status quo ante bellum. But that isn't necessarily linked to the idea of like, is it a war? Are we all in? Are we all in for all in? Like that I think is the weakness in that model. And like, well, we've got to be realistic about facts on the ground. I mean, just look at what's probably going to happen to Ukraine. We aren't building an iron mountain and sending it to Ukraine. We are dribbling. I don't know what analogy, but we are not. You know, the effectively the line is probably going to be drawn, and therefore stuff that was on the west side of the line is now going to be on the east side of the line, and that you know it looks more like appeasement in the 1930s than it does the legacy of 1944. But anyway, we can
Yeah,
hit that on the appropriate slide.
yeah, but it is, and I mean, and that's all very important, and I mean, it's yeah, if you're facilitating dictators, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Going back to what you said on terminology and war, and the use of the word war, there's certainly been a lot of attempt over the last 12 months to try and position where we are now in terms of recent history. And again, 1936, 1937, 1938. You also lots of terms. I mean, so CGS in the UK, General Sir Rowley Walker's he's taken the axis of upheaval as his term for it. But what interested me was I was in Finland for a conference at the beginning of the year and was talking to a Finnish colonel there who, I mean, I think the Finns are phenomenal, but he was saying that by all accounts, talking to people he still knows on the other side, Vladimir Putin puts this at the end of 1942. So in his mind, and which again is interesting in itself, that he is drawing, if you like, a comparison with the Second World War and the Great Patriotic War and the struggle that the Soviets faced. He sees it as effectively it's just prior to Stalingrad, and that all Russia needs to do is just carry on doing the same, and then it'll punch through. Um, Now, if it is the case, that does concern me a great deal because, obviously, as we know, those of you on this call, I'm sure, know your Second World War history. After Stalingrad, the Soviets pretty much keep on going in one direction, and the war does reach a sort of termination point where there is a kind of acceptance that there is a line and both sides will adhere to it. Who knows? Who can say how far the Soviets would have gone if they'd have had the chance? So, yeah, 1942.
Okay, I'm going to move on to technological over-reliance.
So, I mean, I think this is particularly relevant to where we are, and I've already touched on some of this in that sort of then and now. I mean, what wins the Second World War is probably another way to look at it. How is victory? And victory in itself is another very interesting word to try and define. But how is victory secured? And I think many narratives, many accounts. I mean, I've been sort of talking about you have to assemble fighting power. I'm always drawn to Fuller. So JFC Fuller in one of his lectures at the Staff College in 1923, he said that war is simple. War is about getting a force together, moving it forward, hitting your opponent, and making sure your opponent doesn't hit you back. And actually, in some respects, how can you disagree with that? But if you look at certain narratives, the Second World War is a war about it's a technology race. And it may well be, in the background because you've got Manhattan, and let's not forget that the atomic bomb or nuclear weapons, however you want to call them now, it's not built to launch against the Japanese. It's built as a weapon to be used against Germany because it's believed that Germany is ahead. And actually, in many respects, it was until Hitler determined that it was a science he wasn't interested in and didn't need it. But you've got Manhattan in the background, but you've got all these other things that you've got V weapons, and you've got jet engines, and I mean the list could go on. And I mean there are plenty of lectures out there that look at the technology that it came out of war, because being an existential struggle, people were prepared to invest money in platform development that they wouldn't do in times of peace. And again, there's a parallel where we're at now, but I think that's too easy to say that the Second World War is won by technology. I think you've got to look at it as a fusion. It's still won by men and women fighting in muddy fields, forests, you know, coastal, whatever it might be. But then progressively, technology becomes more and more available and is employed and better coordinated in terms of how it's used. So old ideas that evolve and develop in contact, which of course is again the essence of military business. No plan survives first contact or tends to survive first contact with the enemy, and having that technological overlay. But if you look at where we are now, just to sort of try and finish it in Ukraine, certainly last year, I think the big Ukrainian counter-offensive, it was supposed to be, it was going to be about how technology was being employed, and it ran into fixed Russian defenses and couldn't really ever get any maneuver going. Certainly didn't get any momentum going, and that was it. So I think there was a technological over-reliance or a narrative of that's come out of it. I can see some comments there, Ed.
Yeah, on it. So yeah, Ian's thrown in some Lanchester equations. Fighting strength is efficiency in fighting times, numbers squared. The West goes for higher efficiency, lower numbers. Red generally goes for lower efficiency, but higher numbers. Discuss. Sounds like he set you an essay title there.
Yeah, no, well, thanks. I'm gonna steal that, but keep it for later because I'm currently writing a piece for Chaser on the nuclear battlefield of the 1950s, and thinking that went into how you could survive, and not just survive on that, but how you could sort of prosecute a successful campaign in a tactical nuclear battle space. But where I'm going, this is Dupuy. So, for example, Dupuy, and looking at his figures and tables on comparing lethality of weapons. It's again, it's that back to that, is war an art or a science, or a blend of both? Um, it helps. It doesn't hurt, does it? Sides that can come up with, well, whether it be those exquisite, or whether it be a play on an existing tech, which often is the case, but that is turned into something that's far more effective, and perhaps to again sort of take General Rowley's key message, more lethal. Something that gets decisive effect. So, I think if you don't have it, if you're just relying upon a light force that's not very well equipped, it's probably not going to go too well for you.
Yeah, we could talk about this a lot. A couple of points I wanted to sort of focus on was equipping the person versus sort of staffing the equipment. So, and it also links to the idea of coin, where there's lots of images now of the military with a person wearing lots of exquisite technology rather than technology enabling a person. So to use Ian's kind of example, like we try and say like the war fighter has got the best helmet, the best night vision, the best comm system, the best ballistic protection, the best training, the best rifle. And arguably red is like, we're gonna have the worst infantrymen in the world, but they're gonna walk over your shattered corpses because we're gonna smash you with all the fire, and we're gonna find you twice the range that you can hit us, and all that. Which is just an interesting kind of cultural divide between where they see the value. That it's almost, the value is not in the person, the value is in what all the people together as a system do. Whereas our value is people, working together. And it's like the picture you've got here. You've got a single soldier in a picture, whereas if we go to the left, we've got half of the Africa Corps sort of thing. It like what are you trying to get out of your system? And there's a lot of energy wasted on 5.56 versus 7.62 versus 6.8, and we don't seem to be talking about, hold on, people, we can't find the enemy at a range and hit them. Their range band exceeds our range band. We haven't got any air defense. Why is everyone talking about the caliber of the rifle we're firing? It seems a lot of stuff just gets down to equipment, or not how we fight, how we get into theater before being destroyed by hypersonics, and all this sort of stuff. For me, it's very interesting where the debate seems to land in the West. And I appreciate entirely that you've got Russian Mobics going to war with aluminium or fake body armor, which is obviously not something I'm encouraging. But it's an interesting juxtaposition to me.
Well, it is, and I mean, talking with or listening to interviews with Ukrainian commanders in sort of forward positions, their discipline, their equipment, their will to win is so far greater than their opponents. And they may lose one sort of wounded or killed in an action, and the Russians are losing 50, 100. But ultimately, Russia has demonstrated consistently it's willing to lose far more. So that sort of advantage in equipment. I mean, I suppose the best, well, not best, but a good parallel, because looking at light forces and thinking about as well that sort of whole elite, airborne forces in the Second World War. If you want to try and draw a legacy and what message, or what might or might not be learned, the point about airborne forces is once they jump out of aircraft, they become not particularly well equipped infantry, who are almost entirely dependent on what they've jumped with and then what they can be equipped with. Now, obviously, or sustainment, sorry. I mean, obviously, I'm driving towards Market Garden, another sort of classic British example of turning a defeat into a victory in some respects, from the strategic narrative of it. But you invest a huge amount in preparing that force to deploy. And actually, one of the reasons why it deploys at Market Garden is it constitutes the last sort of division really of trained and properly equipped, and it would have been broken down and turned into a ground fighting role had it not dropped at Arnhem. So the British troops, there's a big so what. Which is better? Would you have a battalion of airborne, or would you have a brigade of infantry that's actually got the equipment to get them in the fight? Because you also make a good point about getting there. That also is a big concern for me, how you actually get into the battle space.
I'm going to move us on to time. Everyone's
Yeah.
favorite, a bit of doctrinal rigidity.
Ooh, yes. Well, funny you should say everybody's favorite. After 25 years of military education, I'm not so sure I agree based on what I saw. And I suspect there was some irony in that. I mean, I don't know. You see, I think this is a good question based on the Second World War, because I'm not really sure the degree to which there is a doctrine there. I mean, there is obviously, British, again, I'm focusing in on the British experience most on this. You've got field service regulations with various updates. You've had big thinkers. I mean, Wavell in particular, Field Marshal Wavell is a serious player in writing these and pushing them out. And you will have they will be employed as TCPs or whatever you want to call them, but I don't think I've always taken by the fact that whatever you thought you could do from the British experience of the Second World War, 1940 demonstrates that you can't, because it's different to maybe what you've anticipated, or you've been a bit naive, or there's various other routes you could go with it, but you then have to spend from 40 onwards trying to relearn the business of how you fight war. Which even, I mean, I'm always taken by, I've been to Normandy many times, and lucky, through my work at Shrivenham to go with veterans on a number of occasions in the past. Alas, not so much now, but and I remember talking with one guy who landed sort of first wave on Sword, and he said he watched as snipers basically more or less took out most of the junior officer um, grouping, because despite the fact that they'd done all of this training and all this preparation, they hadn't concealed their rank, and they were the only people on the battlefield that had binoculars. So that sounds easy after the event to sort of make these clever, smart observations, but it's not. The point is that doctrine they were following. There was nothing to say not to do that. And despite having trained as assault divisions or assault brigades for, in some cases, 2 years, nobody had thought to think of that. Because war is a human business. And that for me is the one thing I've taken away from all my study. War is a human business. And actually, however much you try, I don't think you're ever going to really fully understand human, and what your opponent's going to do. They have a vote. They might have a doctrine, but actually, it doesn't mean they necessarily have to adhere to it. So you can see the kind of post-Cold War period, we do then progressively go down the rabbit hole of almost endless doctrine. And I mean, like I'm sure you have, I've read a lot of it, and some of it's very interesting, but I would say that for me, it shouldn't be dogmatic. It should be something that's a guide. Certainly shouldn't be rigid. There should be a flexibility and a fluidity to it. It's a sort of, it might offer you, if you like, first principles or here's best practice. But again, it's that back to the von Moltke piece. No contact doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. And I'm not sure whether we did come out of the Second World War doctrinally rigid, but I think going into the period that followed, as we were uncertain really what we were doing, because we were these different kind of conflicts going on, it was right. If we've got doctrine, that will give us the rail, that will give us the guide that will allow us to go forward. But I remain at best agnostic about the value of doctrine.
I think the Soviets came out of World War II with a much more scientific approach to doctrine, and you see their
Definitely.
fire table calculator thing, which has also had a bit of a failure in Ukraine because they haven't been following it, as in
But
they're saying if you wanted to subdue the enemy
yeah,
in this town, this is the fire mission you require, these calibers at this duration. And then obviously because of the corruption and incompetence, that didn't happen.
And isn't that the point though? That I mean, you're absolutely right in what you say. I mean, the Soviets, I mean, by far and away, I mean, they to go back to my sort of starting throwaway line about art or science, they very much see warfare as a science. They very much recognize that, as someone just put up about Maskroka and um, but then when you get into it, all of these things that you've learned, all these things that you've studied, all of these things that you maybe think at an organizational level, you've integrated to the point where they kind of become first nature. That's not the case, and that's where it goes wrong. So I'm not dismissing us. I mean, there are some who are actually sort of very hard over and would say, "What's the point?" I don't agree with that. I think there is a great point, not least because a lot of doctrine, of course, and this is the historian in me, a lot of doctrine draws upon historical example to provide, if you like, the sort of the foundational blocks. Um, but I think there does still have to be that kind of almost fluidity to it to recognize that, the situations that you prepare for can look very different when you're in it.
I was going to say, I think the West actually had less rigidity coming out of World War II because of the experience. This is what Jim Storr talks about in his webinar with us as well, how
Yeah.
people kind of just knew what they needed to do, and then through training that was handed down. But now we've kind of, lost the experience of large scale combat. So we are relying on our doctrine more and more, and doctrine proliferates and it gets quite complicated, and it almost becomes this kind of like justification for technology. Previous slide, IMDO doctrine, like I don't understand it. I tried to read it,
No, nor do I, but yeah.
which also terrifies me when in the event of a large scale war, we're going to have to call up reservists and civilians and give them very, very um, short time frame training. And then if you hand them the MDO booklet, which is 1,000 pages, it's not going to work. So we need to have something which is applicable to the second army as much as it is to the first army and the second army's equipment and
Hugely,
all that. So I worry
hugely.
we've built this kind of unicorn that we're never going
Yeah,
to write.
yeah, and I mean, just to echo the point you make there, I see the next big war as being a temporal war, and by that I mean that time is always a key factor in conflict, but certainly, and again, I stress from the British Army perspective, if you sort of look at whether it be the First World War, the Second World War, even Korea, and then a few of these other sort of limited wars, you have a period to absorb whatever it is that happens at the beginning, quite often some form of defeat or certainly reverse. But you then have a period to regenerate, build back up, and actually capture some lessons. Well, identify, because of course that's the key first. You have to identify the lesson before you can begin to learn it. And then you can start to implement it. I'm not sure if that luxury is going to be available in the next one, because I just unless both sides fight themselves to a rapid state of exhaustion where there's almost a strategic pause on both sides, I don't think certainly not going to be able to give somebody 1,000 pager on MDO and say, there you go, crack that overnight and you'll be all right.
Cool. I'm going to move us on. C2 complexities.
So, well, I mean, again, we've tried here really. I know these are just sort of big hand, but yeah, I mean, C2 remains a constant, doesn't it? I mean, whoever Well, it's actually changed a bit. So I went to see one of the Kermit Roosevelt lectures this year. General Randy George giving it at Russi. And he, he talked a bit about C2, but he then went on to say actually that the side that will win is the side that integrates better, which is a kind of take on it. But he was talking more holistically across the force, more generally. But we're into the realms of mission command, and again, somebody did flash up about the Soviets, and I mean, I think the Soviets in their own way, probably were pretty good at it. The Germans obviously were. In the UK, we didn't really even sort of through to the 80s have much awareness. And that's not to say we weren't doing it; it's just that we didn't necessarily understand or include it in terms of our approach. But it's not easy. I mean, I read a piece today that will be coming out in Chaser next year, which is again looking at Montgomery, Bernard Montgomery, and I mean, the degree to which ultimately he depends upon an extremely capable chief of staff, so Freddie de Gangen, who is able to, if you like, act as an interface So I suppose, and mindful of time, all I would really say on C2 is it is complex. It doesn't just happen overnight. It does require a significant, well, it requires good leadership, and then it requires that leadership to make best use of the resources available to it. That was the lesson in the Second World War, where the United States just shelled through senior commanders because it had the luxury of having more senior commanders behind it. As we go forward, though, again, and what you said earlier there about what your second echelon looks like, who are the junior commanders of the next waves? Where do they get their skill set from? The real world or the civilian world is still a very different one to the military structure and organization, the positives of the esprit de corps and the elan but also the hierarchical nature of it. Remember, one of the great problems in Normandy in 1944 is fighting in the bocage, so terrain, another constant of warfare. But it's fighting in the bocage, which, despite all the preparation, nobody really seems to have thought through in terms of how this is going to restrict maneuver. And then famously, it's an American staff sergeant who comes up with a sort of back of the cigarette packet solution of taking old beach defences, welding them onto on platforms and essentially just carving pathways through the bocage. That wouldn't have happened in the British Army. Even a senior NCO, I don't think he's going to have the ability to insert an idea that very quickly goes up and is accepted and is implemented quickly. I can't say about the modern day scenario practitioners. I'm sure it's not an issue in Ukraine because we've already got legion examples. In Ukraine, it seems to be an almost entirely open, safe space within the Ukrainian military. If you've got an idea, just throw it out there. There are no bad ideas. Again, I guess that comes back to being in an existential conflict. For more traditional, I don't know. Well, I mean, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Ed, or anybody else on the call who's a practitioner, but it just strikes me that there's an inertia that will always exist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if mission command's got a future if you can, as a commander, just sit with your drone and tell everyone where to move. It's a tension for sure. What I would say is that in war, I think people adapt the C2 to meet the requirements. Again, the training C2 of maybe 18 layers or meeting all together for a nice comfy orders group with your head torches. Sometimes that then goes out the window, and it's you have more of the 18th century, 19th century naval orders, which is like, I'm going to give you orders at the start. You're going to go forth,
Yeah.
work within the intent, and if you come back, if you need more, come back. Otherwise, just crack on, and I'll see you at the end.
Which is a variation of mission command, isn't it? It's just a very broad, this ultimately, as I see it, is what we're trying to achieve, and meet you at the end. Equally, though, I mean, the degree to which have we returned to an empty battlefield, or a lot of the evidence coming out, let's face it, shows that it's it's just very, very difficult to maneuver. It's very, very difficult to operate in the battle space of the current conflict. This is as much about it's a war of concealment as opposed to a war of maneuver, which the Germans face that problem in Normandy again, and in fact for the duration of the campaign, sort of from well, certainly from sort of late June 44 onwards. So they operated at night. That doesn't exist as an option anymore. And technology is, again, talking to the Finns, I mean, a lot of the work they do is on conceal. And even they, who are brilliant at it, it's some of the tech now, it's almost impossible to make yourself invisible on the battlefield. And that's without squaddies taking mobile phones forward with them.
The perennial problem. Okay, so raising sights slightly, alliances and strategic inflexibility. We've talked a bit about the less than war kind of thing, and I suppose again, Andrew, like over to you, but like NATO and the UN seem to be the two ones we had born out of World War II, which are not doing as well as they could be.
I mean, excuse me. I mean, the UN, yes, I mean, answer that one easily. I mean, the problem for the UN was and I've already touched on it in terms of its origins, but it already the sort of the security system starts to break down. The San Francisco Treaty is signed, but it never really comes up to that bit about enforcement. And I mean, threats are just that. If you don't have anything to back it up, it's just empty. And so that's why the UN was always going to be condemned. Has done some decent peace and security stuff, but never had the means to actually enforce action. Was supposed to. It was all going to be done by air power, but it never emerged. NATO, I mean, interesting. I argued. I'm actually an advocate of NATO now, having not been pretty much all the time I was at Shrivenham, because it was an alliance without a purpose. I mean, it had kind of met its objective in some respects. And I do wonder if Putin had maybe just waited a little bit longer, whether the sort of terminal malaise might have kicked into NATO. But it's never been stronger in many respects. I know there's some challenges. A couple of the member states are obviously not 100% convinced, and then there's the big unknown about what President Trump to be will do in his views towards NATO. But I mean, which other than say, for example, the United States, China, well, even Russia's demonstrated it can't fight alone. I know it's not a total war for it at the moment. It's not fully mobilized. Its industry, its economic base, it's not gone for mass mobilization. It did have a period of it, but even it though has required support from, well, a list of others, future historians to determine the extent of it. There are very few states that can actually fight a war for any period of time on their own. So maybe that is one thing that came out of the Second World War. The United Nations, as they were termed, it required them to come together as a group to defeat a much smaller, the Pact of Steel, the Axis. It was never really called that, but and it becomes groups fighting groups. Yes, there is an inflexibility then that goes with that. And the big question remains about NATO. NATO exists on the basis of a promise, which has partly been enacted once after 9/11, but with very limited sort of scope and actually very limited effect. Nobody really knows if Article 5 will hold true. And that's a big what if as we go forward. The Polish guarantee said that Britain would send forces to defend Poland. And yet, we never got anywhere near sending troops to defend Poland. A piece of paper is just that, you can put whatever words and put whatever signatures you want on it, but it's got to be matched by deeds, and that remains the big unknown. And I think that's clearly where Vladimir Putin is directing a lot of his effort. I don't think he believes in the sanctity of the Treaty of Washington. I don't think he believes that if push comes to shove, is the Spanish Legion going to go and fight in Estonia to defend the Baltics? I don't know. I happen to think the Legion is a brilliant buying force, but I don't know. So this comes down to perception, and that sometimes is the problem with alliances, particularly 32 member states in NATO. They're not going to have the same outlook on everything.
I sort of feel this would be a good points from the floor on that. It's quite an important aspect for our current Western defense discourse.
Sorry, say again.
I'm sort of inviting others to dive on if they've got
Yeah.
views on NATO and the UN.
I mean, one could ask, is there a NATO successor? I mean, I'm often asked by Australian friends, and is there an Indo-Pacific NATO or a version of?
Well, what I was going to say
Yeah.
maybe is that we've got a
Yeah.
proliferation of security, collective economic and security agreements. So you've got BRICS, ASEAN. Arguably, Trump might slice NATO in two with those who are paying 2% and those who aren't. So you've got sort of NATO Diet Coke and NATO full fat, and so it's an interesting observation that as much as anyone might say NATO doesn't work, there's a lot of these things that are popping up, vice them not being considered useful at all.
I mean, the comment that's just come about poker and chess. I mean, I'm not very good at poker. I'm not particularly brilliant at chess, but I mean, I definitely get the where that's coming from. I mean, when I was younger, it was always, the US had been late for the first two world wars. It was going to be early for the third. Um, I'm not sure. I suppose with everything that's going on at the moment, it's actually, to even be flippant like that. But do we believe that a Trump White House will come to the defense of Bulgaria? I don't know. It's just a hanging question out there. Where I am interested though is Poland. I mean, Poland is a key country for us, the chaser that I work for, and Poland is what, up 4% on GDP spending. And the polls and Trump had a good relationship first time round. I know the politics have changed a bit in Poland, but there is still a camp Trump, I believe, in Poland, and I'll be very interested to see if he pivots away from because Poland is so central to everything that's going to happen in the future. The British Army of the Rhine is going to be the British Army of, well, not necessarily a river feature, and I don't think it is the Suwalki Gap, but I think there will be some fairly significant movement at some point of forward. I know we've got the forward forces deployed in the Baltics, but the Baltics are a terrible place to fight because you just don't have the space. Um, but anyway, I go down a rabbit hole there.
Okay, ethical and legal constraints. This is getting us to the end of the slide deck.
Yeah, we've just got this one and then one more, and the last one is in fact, no, this might even be the last one. Yeah, I mean, again, looking at legacy of it's interesting. I'm doing a project. One of the many projects I'm doing, I'm looking at lessons from the Falklands. Not there's nothing in there in terms of we're not been asked to do any work on expeditionary warfare or anything like that, but just looking at as a conflict which was largely contained within the realms of the British military. And I was struck by some papers the other day where essentially, as part of the after action, British officers, pretty much to a man, and it would have been a man then, were saying that they weren't really aware of the laws of armed conflict, and they weren't really aware of what constituted war crimes versus not war crimes. Like, I mean, things that there was an instance, for example, at Goose Green where some Argentine POWs were helping with some EOD. They'd agreed to do it. They hadn't been pressed to do it. They'd agreed to do it. Ordnance went off. A couple of them were killed, and it was a moot point actually as to whether it was a war crime because it wasn't contravention. Where I'm going with that is that after the Second World War, you would have hoped perhaps that here was a vast body of events and experience. I mean, I sort of started with my line about rogue heroes. That's led me, I'm writing a book on the commando order, which is known but not really known enough about. If you ever go and do a battlefield tour of the Bulge, you will go to Malmedy almost certainly, and you'll look at Malmedy, and it goes on. I mean, and that's on the sort of military side. On the civ side, we mentioned Holocaust, and we mentioned things like Oradour or Glan and places like Lidice. The Second World War was a particularly bestial conflict. I mean, wars are horrible by nature. It's about violence, and it's about who can actually be, in many respects, more violent than the other and get the job done. But the degree to which non-combatants were not respected, I think, was particularly noticeable. Look at what's going on in Ukraine. Look at Booker. Look at Irpin. Look at many others. I don't get a sense that whatever was learned from that, and when you can make the point about how the Soviets conducted their campaign from particularly 43 after breaking out from Stalingrad, the rape of Berlin, and in fact, not just Berlin, but most of Germany as they went through it. So I I don't. There are plenty of lessons, and I think lessons that were identified and in some cases were learnt, but it comes down to outlook. And whereas NATO is absolutely signed up to this, I'm not sure whether Red is. And again, we don't really know enough about China. I think still, my Australian friends make the point of saying that really they've not done anything since Korea. There's things that they've done, but not sort of done on a massive level. We don't really know how they'd fight a war, but in Korea, they certainly didn't have a great deal of respect for any ethical and legal constraints. And the blurring that exists between competent and non-competent, well, that's unfortunately, I don't see that going anywhere. So, go back to the Second World War, 50,000 French men, women, and children die during Operation Overlord. It's De Gaulle is aware of it. He only made aware of the plan a few days before for OPSEC reasons, but nonetheless, it's considered to be a regrettable but acceptable level of loss. If you look at Gaza, and I mean, I don't really want to get sort of too dragged into that, but 44,000 or 45,000 dead. It's We live in an age of technology, to go back to that point about technology and the ability to be discriminate and proportionate, which of course are key considerations of Justin Bellow, but it's not, it's not, and I don't think, can't see the situation in any future war where it is, and that's not even getting into the realms of if you breach the threshold and get into tactical nuclear or heaven forbid, back to chem bio. So yeah, it worries me a lot.
So I don't know if you picked up that I think Sweden and maybe others are pulling out of the Ottawa Convention on landmines.
I had not seen that. Is that as of what, today or yesterday
It's
or?
like it's sort of trending this week kind of thing. Just I mean, overshadowed by an ICBM launch, so you
Yeah,
might struggle to find it in the headlines. But it doesn't
uh,
always have to be about WMD
no,
or sort of. I mean, and thermobaric use or
yeah,
CS gas use,
yeah,
light
yeah,
chemical use as well in Ukraine, I think is also trending.
yeah, and I'm not surprised. I mean, if anything, of course, and we're going back not so much to. I mean, you know, a lot of American troops, and I say a lot, but yeah, some American troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, and they were carrying radioactive detection devices. Um, they all landed. I mean, gas masks were mandatory. I mean, it was assumed that weapons of mass destruction, to sort of coin the post-war term, would be used, and they weren't for reasons that perhaps in part are ethical and legal, but actually more to do with. It's famously known that Hitler himself was gassed, and therefore that's why he was very reluctant to use it. Churchill was much less reluctant to use it, and the anticipated defence of Britain in the event of a German invasion, pretty much first wave German troops would have been gassed. And then it's what lies beyond it. So, I mean, if you're fighting for your survival and you have the means available to you, you're likely to use them. There is this also trending story about Ukraine perhaps driving to develop some sort of independent nuclear capability. I mean, Ukraine, as of Soviet days, was amongst the leaders. Most of the engineers were Ukrainian. And there are some stories out there about, well, if we can't necessarily count on everybody to help us, what if we can basically get into the game of deterrence and say, right, well, we've got 10 of these. What do you think? So I don't know. I suspect we are being drawn that way because ultimately nuclear deterrence is still at the very top end of it.
Although we have seen a non-armed nuclear state attack a nuclear state in
Yeah, yeah,
Kursk. Yeah,
yeah,
but yeah, it's just an interesting one of like the sacred cows are being slain, and people are still printing the sacred cow like pamphlets.
absolutely.
I digress.
And I
Okay,
think
so
that's
that
it.
is us to the end of the slide deck.
Yeah.
So any questions on anything or anything not covered from the floor? Okay, on behalf of Andrew, what other Second World War legacies have we now foolishly forgotten? His personal bias would be a comprehensive and vertically integrated deception service. Okay, A Force, D Force, R Force, all
Yeah,
the tactical level
yeah.
capabilities.
Bang on.
Yeah.
I mean, I was only talking with this very question about, well, in part SAS. So Dudley Clark is in Rogue Heroes, but they horribly distort the character of Dudley Clark in it, and it was one of the things that I really went into bat with them about, and they did actually slightly dampen down. Their original version of him wasn't very good. But I was only talking with my director about, if you look at both Ukraine and Gaza, so sort of October 23 and February 22, there is in both there is a significant deception activity that's going on. And yes, I would agree with you. I think if I read that correctly, I think that there isn't enough attention paid to it. Um, because if one considers the benefits, if you can achieve strategic surprise, um, it gives you an opportunity that otherwise wouldn't exist. But it is a skill. It doesn't just happen overnight. And of course, there's maybe an ethical and legal issue in that. And I mean, Churchill was all for it and supported it. He was a massive patron of things like, well, this what he called sneaks and stinkers. Because again, I go back to war's a serious business. If you're in it, you're in it to win. If you're not, then frankly, you're better off not being in it. And I wonder, I mean, we're good just looking at that through our one good eye. I think we're better increasingly on the sort of the tech approaches to it. I think one of the things that's coming out, don't forget from a British perspective, there's a lot of cross-fertilization going on. There's a lot of learning. Although there's been a lot of training for Ukrainian troops in the UK, there has also been then cross-fertilization. And I think, electronic warfare is one of the areas, and drones inevitably, that we're learning quite a bit on. But yeah, I think it's an important consideration. Unfortunately, my director wrote his master's thesis on it, and so it turns out he's very interested in doing some work on deception. So that's one of the things we'll do next year. I wonder about culture. I mean, I know we're out of time, but I do wonder whether we really, why do we have the fascination of this war? And there are some, certainly in terms of certainly in the UK and in terms of secondary education, who actually question whether it should be there at all, and really would quite like to do away with it. Um, I think that on a British level is more to do with fears of sort of triumphalism and finest hour, but I think we're missing a trick if we don't remember the mistakes of our forefathers, because most war, not all, but most war is actually as a result of mistake. It's miscalculation. It's where ego gets in the way, bias perhaps gets in the way. Just obviously there's always examples where people just don't like one another, economics, but we need to study the past to try and avoid it happening again in the future. And I'm not sure whether that cultural legacy, I'd be sad to see it go.
Yeah, we didn't cover it in the slide, but it was in the poster at the front, the sort of the popular media, the
Yeah, well, you've
films.
got Kelly's Heroes there, haven't you? Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
great film, great film. But also using Fight Club's sort of niche in the wargaming space, World War II titles continue to proliferate.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do, and will continue to do so as well. And I mean, something like Band of Brothers, for example. That's that is at a societal level. That's beyond just people who are interested in study of conflict. That is something that I think is very much embedded at a societal level. The fact that it's on at any given time. So there is some stuff out there. A brand new film on the Blitz that's just trailing. I mean, it just come out. It's still there, but I was involved in some of the 80th anniversary for D-Day, and I'm starting to see a little bit of the 80th anniversary for End of the War next year, and that's already got a different tone to it, as one perhaps might expect. And I wonder whether the memorialization, whereas the first war and the centenary of it was significant globally, I wonder if we're still here in 20 years' time, whether the Second War will get the same treatment.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think the enduring relevance or attraction is it was quote, the last good war where you could kind of draw a line and say these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. Like if you actually dig into it, not at all like that, but certainly in popular culture. I mean, I'm going to use the example from Canada recently, which is quite embarrassing, but they pulled up a Ukrainian, like, yeah, and he fought the Russians in the 1940s, and then it was like, oh wait, that means he fought on is part of the
Yeah,
Waffen SS, and it was
he was
like,
with the SS.
and
Yeah,
it was a great example of the sort of where it doesn't necessarily pull through, like all the way
I,
from the past to the present.
I think it's one of the challenges with the Finns, actually, because, again, having resisted the Soviets, they then align themselves strategically with the Germans just because it's the old enemy of my enemy is my friend. But yeah, you do have to be careful. Is the one new message. Let's just have a look. Where Eagles Dare, Guns of Never Own. Yep, can't beat them. That's what Christmas is for. Personally, A Bridge Too Far will always be my favorite film.
I thought you were a Zulu man, but obviously
I
I'm a safe.
do. I know, actually. Oh, now you've got me a bit. Again, it's that sort of that tradition of great British defeat, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, I suppose maybe that's the last thing to end on, the underdog story, that we didn't seek World War II, we weren't ready. It's all the kind of hallmarks of, like, but we still won in the end, and we sacrificed and we made a better
It,
peace kind of thing,
yeah,
where as opposed to a war of aggression,
yeah.
which we messed up.
It's the whole finest hour, and I mean, from an American perspective, of course, it's a sort of coming of age story as well. I think, America as it sort of becomes outward facing more than it had been before. For Europe, it becomes progressively a regeneration story, and one of kind of progressive political union. So yeah, there's narratives that can be spun from it, but also bad ones.
Cool. And with that, we're going to draw the webinar to a close. So, Andrew, thanks very much for coming on. The parting challenge that I do to everyone in this 2024 webinar series is today, somewhere in the world, someone is training to kill you. What are you doing about it? So what is the one thing you can do in your organization to prepare it for the next war and save lives, whether that's a small thing or a big thing or a series of small things over time? What I would say is a lot of the things we spoke about on this are absolutely war gameable. We have a Ukraine war game, Glory to Heroes. We have a World War II Normandy logistics game, Supply and Steel, working on a Kaliningrad one. Ian, who's on the call, has done a Kaliningrad war game. He's also done a drone air defense type game as well. So all this stuff is absolutely gameable from a professional and education exploration perspective. So there really is no excuse to not sort of try it out. If you like this and you want to get more of the content, then subscribe on our YouTube channel by clicking the bell icon. We have a playlist where all the webinars will go. This will go up in about a week. We also have an X account, LinkedIn, and as I say, other videos on the YouTube site. So please go and subscribe to all that stuff so you stay abreast. You can sign up to our newsletter, which comes out every month or so. And if you want to join Fight Club, then go to our website, click the join button, fill in a form. Someone will then approve you. You'll then be invited to join our Discord, where all the delicious detail is discussed and games are organized and so on and so forth. And if you are a member already, then you could head to the virtual bar channel in the Fight Club International Discord and talk about the webinar if you so wish. All that's left for me to do is to thank our guest speaker once again. Andrew, it's been a pleasure. I'll now close the chat.